Trumptopian. A special segment of the Almost Daily Zencast. Hosted by the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's talk Trump.
Greetings and salutations to you, dear friends and interweb family. Coming to you from rainy Southern California, and amen for that rain. Thank you. And being broadcast vis-a-vis the interwebs all around the world, listened to from Spain to Australia, from Malta to Germany, from Cyprus to Canada, from the UK to India, from Germany to good old Trumptopia of the USA. It's your favorite talk radio style podcast show, hosted by a fictional character that doesn't actually exist, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And good morning, Trumptopia. Happy holidays. I hope you have survived the general Xmas madness. That's its own subject, really. Could be its own thing. On any other given year, if my show existed 8 years ago, which it tragically did not, just to go off on a tangent, how awesome would it be if I'd been doing this show since when podcasts were invented? I wanted to. I remember hearing about podcasts for the very first time and going, that's like having your own radio station. I kind of want it, but also I don't know what I would talk about. I was a fool. Coulda, shoulda, woulda. But here we are instead. What is it, like 4 years into it? Welcome to the show. I don't know if you've been listening to it for a long time or a short time, but I am deeply and genuinely full of gratitude for you welcoming me inside your ear holes. And now, let's turn our attention to some of the madness in the world today. First, let's talk about the Nashville Christmas Day bombing. It's already developed as a story quite a bit. I was sort of generally aware of it on Christmas, but as you may have noticed, I was on a tear. I was on a thing. I was on a jam. The spirit was filling me, and I needed to talk about stuff relating to, the reason for the season. And I want to reiterate something that I said, and I don't think I made enough of a deal out of it. I understand that some people might feel offended by some of the things that I talk about on my show, especially when it comes to such beloved subjects. Let me back up. To such beloved and often severely misunderstood subjects as organized religion, the person of Jesus, etc., etc., etc. And so I thank you, those of you who downloaded and listened to those episodes, and I hope that you did not get offended. Okay, so that's why I didn't talk about the bombing on the day of. I was swept up in sort of momentum of inspiration, and while I was keeping tabs on the news, nothing about what I saw prompted me to break the momentum I had. Some might say that that's a cop-out and whatever, and that I should have addressed it on the day of, but here we are, anyways, now, today, And let's talk about it. Strange and curious thing. I wrote some notes down because I was paying attention all throughout. I have to say there were three big things that I kept waking up to after Christmas. And not the least of which was this thing in Nashville. And it's not the first time, tragically, that someone has done something like this, right? Obviously, everyone's minds goes to Timothy McVeigh right away. And similarly, the person who's now been named as suspect is a disenfranchised, disgruntled, white-skinned American citizen. Not some foreign activist with an agenda, but an American that's disgruntled with where things are in America. And as you may have noticed, I speak quite openly on the show about how I believe that we are being poked and prodded, some might say herded, we're definitely being encouraged towards choosing violence. And examples of it crop up all the time. Now, I haven't seen this yet, but I think you'll agree that especially if you have already, I will not be surprised. It should not surprise anybody if and when an interesting boatload of conspiracy theory about this incident comes out, right? Especially now that we have a name, Anthony Quinn Warner. I think he was 63 years old. Everything developed really quickly. And because Christmas Day was Christmas Day, and, I acted on the inspiration that I had, and then I felt very done. And I didn't really want to do a new episode for at least a day or two to kind of like rest my voice and just sort of absorb the world after Christmas. Some of the most fascinating details of the information that emerged about this incident include the audio recording. We'll come back to that in a hot second. How quickly authorities got the VIN number. The interesting way in which they were able to narrow down their search so quickly, because that was pretty darn quick. And then again, that speaks to the power, I guess, of security video, which we can do episodes and episodes about that, just as a subject, right? As a theme unto itself, in and of itself, whichever. So before I knew it, they were searching the suspect's house, and I hadn't really quite caught up on all the details. I wasn't sure if this guy was a really solid suspect or if he was just sort of like a suspect. I noticed this question floating around about whether or not the AT&T building was being targeted. And we'll talk about that in a hot second. The last interesting thing that I caught in terms of the timeline, like it was the latest development that was something new and not a restating of everything I'd heard before. And I haven't heard a follow-up on this, so I don't know where it stands. I don't know what answers were discovered. But apparently, not too terribly far away, a second truck was identified that supposedly, according to reports, was also playing a similar audio recording as the original RV. So, I mean, that's obviously what's kind of an overview of what's developed. And that's not even everything, right? Like, the fact that they found human remains was this weird, dodgy thing that they were kind of hinting at, but they weren't really talking about for the first, I don't know how long. But then because there seem to have been human remains, at least that's what they're saying in the reporting, right? And they also got tips that pointed to a specific person. They were able to compare those two DNA samples. And that's how they got this guy so quickly. And the audio recording really stood out. The first thing that impressed me about the incident was that there were no fatalities. Given how much damage was done, and although this was mostly a sort of an entertainment district type neighborhood, from what I understand, there was a lot of mixed use, and there were people. There was living spaces in and around, the immediately impacted area. When I first heard that there had been an explosion, a bombing, as it were, I was bracing myself for a gnarly death toll. So to find out there was only just a handful of injuries, I chalk it up to, having something to be grateful for in the midst of an otherwise tragic event. But I was really struck by that, and it was really quite curious. And it wasn't until later that this audio recording information came out, and it took a couple of steps for it to take shape. So I was just very intrigued to find out that whoever put this together and apparently perished in the act, and people are already speculating it was an intentional suicide, although I don't think it's been officially confirmed yet. They don't know anything about motive as of right now. As of this morning, checking the news and whatnot, I haven't seen anybody talking about motive. I've seen people speculating about motive, but I don't know that anyone's made any firm announcements. So my own statements about who this guy is are speculative, right? So there was a lot of questions, and the kinds of things I was watching with an eye for what are the kinds of things that they're going to nitpick at and try to turn into conspiracy theory, right? Because this was, as soon as I heard the news, the little part of my mind that monitors without too much judgment. I try not to judge. I just try to stay topically aware. I don't even try to go too deep because I know that it's all a warren of rabbit holes that either leads to some common nexus points or dead ends, right? That's the overall pattern when it comes to conspiracy theory content. It's either an offshoot or an independent author, or it's part of some organized thing, and those are your two general paths. I know that lots of people would argue against me and saying that I'm wrong, in part because they believe in the conspiracy theories. But if you're new, you'll come to understand that I have a very specific and oddly nuanced opinion on conspiracy theory content and its origins. But put a pin in that and check out the backlog of episodes. Okay, so here's the things that I've come to understand. Again, I'm not a journalist, so I can't claim to have super hardcore verified this. I'm not reporting this to you. I'm sharing you my opinion of what I've been presented as fact. And then, my questions around it. The obvious questions, or obvious conspiracy theory type statements. This is a black flag operation. It was being, an inside job. Tying everything back to if you're a 9/11 truther, then everything's an inside job, right? Every shooting, every explosion, every whatever, the pandemic, it's an inside job. The identifying of a prime suspect so quickly, I'm sure will get critiqued and or criticized. And the AT&T thing, right? I'm fairly certain that that's going to get talked about in relationship to the 5G cluster of conspiracy theory content. It's a whole subset unto its own. There's way too many conflicting conspiracy theories about what 5G really is, all of them claiming to be the absolute truth. Talked about that on previous episodes. Enough to not want to bore people with it now. So people were making a big deal about where they got the VIN number from because the RV looked pretty effing obliterated. Now, it's not impossible that the right shred of the license plate would survive, or not the license plate. Well, a license plate with the registration number would help, right? But the VIN number is stamped on multiple pieces of a car for various reasons, and an explosion, even a gnarly one, does not instantaneously vaporize every little piece of everything, right? It ripped things apart, and different materials get destroyed or obliterated to varying degrees. I wasn't there on the ground, and neither were most people who are perpetuating conspiracy theory in regards to almost any situation. Very few people actually were on the ground. Now, there is, of course, a whole little subset of the conspiracy theory community that's into, like, conspiracy theory community tourism. Just like there's alien sighting tourism and, other forms of, like, what people generally lump together into sort of, like, morbid or dark tourism. But I'm not one of those people, so I'm not making weird, outlandish claims. But from what I understand, based on cross-referencing a lot of the reporting, is that the VIN number the license plate rather, was picked up from video camera, and through that they were able to get a VIN number, which was matched to some piece of the car, I believe. If I've gotten that wrong, I apologize. That makes sense to me, though. That doesn't sound like something that's dubious and mysterious and shady as fuck. That sounds like it is complying with physics and police procedure. So, and as we've seen, they have finally released a piece of footage with a clear view of the explosion. It's not very up close, but it doesn't need to be. And apparently the car, was caught on video in different locations as it made its approach to the place where it parked. Apparently they got like over 500 tips. Some number of them, I don't know how many, pointed to a specific person at a specific address because they owned and or seemed to be living in a very specifically similar RV. And I think it's from that they were able to get what you might call like the baseline genetic sample. They kind of honed in on this guy for all the reasons that you would sort of pick a person to be the top suspect out of your list of suspects. And they got, I don't know how exactly, but they apparently got DNA samples through that avenue and then compared those to the human remains. The second truck, who knows? It's a wild herring. It's already being discussed, I'm sure. Is it a copycat? Is it some joker who thought it'd be funny to like make a similar tape and play it while driving around like an idiot, not realizing that will get you arrested if you outwardly mimic things that are like the MO of a recent act of violence? Zooming back, right? Like the details are fascinating. And at this juncture, it appears like it's all gonna fold or unfold or flow, kind of coalesce around this guy who is apparently deceased. And anyone who may or may not have realized they were facilitating him. And of course, motive. And then the raging debate outside, beyond anything about conspiracy theory, is going to be, why don't we call this guy a domestic terrorist? Now, there's a meme going around already. I just saw it this morning. So I don't know how long it's been around, but as of really early this morning, I saw it. And it's sort of inspired and based on previous memes that there seems to be a dividing line, right? Like as if there was a color-coded chart. Skin tones above this line, mentally ill. Skin tones below this line, terrorist. And, the terrorist grouping are all dark skin tones. And the mentally ill grouping is all, Caucasian, fair, white skin tones. Does that happen? I mean, at the broadest level, obviously, yes. People are biased. But I don't want to use the term by nature, because I think that's a fucking bullshit psyop. But one way or the other, generally speaking, people are biased. They're not all necessarily racists, but there's bias. And we have to confront that, right? Put a pin in that. That's all over there in the how do we proceed to healing ourselves and each other and the entire human species cloud of subjects. Stick that on the giant imaginary corkboard of themes we have either already talked about on the show or will plan on revisiting on the show soon enough. As far as what I think is going on, I think that in the media, I mean, especially right in the sort of centrist and left of center media, they're going to report it out, and I don't want to get into the argument about how the media is corrupt. For those of you who are super new, I'm well aware. Put a pin in that. Talked about it before. We'll talk about it more again, I'm sure. But I think they're going to try to play it according to the framework that they've already been sort of working towards, right? They're going to play with the question of domestic terrorism, why we don't call Caucasian Americans who do violent acts terrorists. And there is an explicit, legal reason. And that's because domestic terrorism doesn't exist in our legislation, right? There is no code or law on any of the levels in which we might legislate it for domestic terrorism, to the best of my understanding. If I'm wrong, by all means, bring us the reference so that we can enlighten ourselves. There's obviously other criminal labels, right? Especially, there's a lot of talk about, what's the word? I can't pull it. Error, file not found. Treason. There's a lot of talk about treason, and you could try to say that maybe treason covers domestic terrorism, but it doesn't really. And it's also just thrown around. I'm sure I'm being accused of treason by people in the Trumptopian world, if they're listening to this podcast. I don't know. And I don't speak about Trumptopia or Trump or the Trump base with hate. In case you haven't heard any of my disclaimers, it's not about that for me. It's about healing. And it's about calling out the nonsense. And there's nonsense on both sides. # 2 wings, 1 bird. Okay, so I'm just a theater nerd from sunny Southern California who's grateful for the rain. Do I know the ultimate truth behind this potentially epically tragic event that thankfully was not epically tragic? No, I don't pretend to know any answers. What do I think the most likely reported on conclusion will be? He's either going to be, team blue or team red. And if he's team red, everybody who opposes Trump and calls him a fearmonger and is accusing him of inciting violence will have yet another example to add to their collection of evidence. Not that there's an absence of. Having said that, obviously people in the center and people on the right are choosing violence too. And although the manipulative content is not coming as overtly and as directly from the leadership figures on the left, as it is with Donald Trump that has hijacked and co-opted the right, it's still there. The content's still being pumped out. And on the left, their whole game is soft shoe nuance. It's totally different, right? Like, what are the fundamentals of the Trumptopian right mentality? It's the oxymoron of superiority and eternal victimhood. And the sharing of and living in a world of non-factual ideological constructs about how things ought to be, as opposed to dealing with how things actually are. The left plays it a little softer, a little gentler, right? The right loves to scream and shout and rattle the saber and beat the war drums and point the fingers and hypocritically accuse everyone of doing precisely what they're doing. The left likes to play the good cop with the white hat, and instead of rattling the saber, they polish their shield, if you get the analogy. I digress. This could have been worse. This fascinatingly wasn't, and that's, what was up with that? That's going to be something, that's going to be one of the entry points for the conspiracy theory community if they're not already using that. I'm actually, to circle back to that issue, I'm actually kind of surprised that I haven't already seen conspiracy theory content about this event and about this guy. But A, I wouldn't be shocked or amazed if it's already out there, and B, I'm kind of suspicious that it's coming if it isn't already out there. If it is a, quote, false flag, then, it's there for the obvious reasons as defined by all those who accuse everything of being a false flag. I'm not really all that interested in that theory, though, for reasons I've already rambled about in various episodes. It's not impossible. I'm not denying that theory. I just don't think... I think that... How do I explain what I think? Inside... everything is an inside job, in singular quotes, as a sort of psyop conditioning. That's where I think it's at, right? Yes, they do black flag inside job operations. Of course they do. And some of them that they talk about in their list of things that are supposedly staged events or manipulative events might very well be. Is this one of them? Perhaps. But as with most conspiracy theory content, what is overlooked by those who are adherents to the given theory is that by adopting all of the talking points, they themselves are being manipulated towards something. And then at that point, it almost becomes irrelevant if the events used to explain and or rationalize the theory even happened or, were or were not false flags. Doesn't matter as long as the manipulation happens. But put a pin in that because I've talked about my oddly nuanced opinion about what conspiracy theory content actually is. And I'll bore you to tears if you've already heard it. Okay, so I think this is one of those events where we will either find out such an overwhelming preponderance of detail, because it really is a genuine, authentic, event, inspired by the things, whatever they are, that inspired it, but that sort of happened spontaneously because that person was primed by the milieu, the gestalt, the ideological landscape, and that's so much more. People will dismiss that, right? Like, conspiracy theorists will dismiss any other explanation of the event because it's urgent to them. It's burningly urgent to them that the listener, whoever the listener is, agree with them and the conspiracy theory. And therein lies how the manipulation works. But what's more frightening is if this event is the result of a spontaneously inspired decision tree. Not spontaneously, because spontaneous makes it sound like it's coming out of nowhere. But rather an undirected, unprompted, overtly. This is the non-professional. It's caused by like I was just saying, the overall environment, the echo chamber of echo chambers, and not, like a paid job. Anyways, we'll have to just watch the space and see how it continues to develop, but I think this event presents an opportunity. This event presents the opportunity to reconnect with our desire to manifest peace in the world. As any violent event, affords us that opportunity, I think. Okay, I've rambled enough for the opening bit. We're going to come back and talk about some of Trump's most recent shenanigans over the holiday weekend, and some interesting numbers coming out of the vaccine story. But let us cleanse the palate mentally, and let's kind of like turn it on a little bit today. Here's a DJ Z track, Elemental, Dear Watson, 'Tis Techno, a Groove Pad Techno Elements remix. 2020's almost over. And we're back. It's Monday, December 28th, 9:19 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Because I failed to do so in the very beginning of today's episode, I just want to say that I'm glad we've survived this far. 2020's been an epic, fuck-off, crazy clusterfuck of crazy madness and shoulda, coulda, woulda, you know? So let's be full of gratitude. Even if you had a crummy Christmas, even if you couldn't be with your family, there's still quite a lot to be grateful for. Gratitude is a interesting thing, folks. Make sure you don't neglect it. Okay, so Trump certainly had a golf-tastic Christmas holiday. And I'm sure he was really quite smug, having thrown a completely unnecessary, totally obvious, meaningless, and useless monkey wrench in the works before jet-setting off to his own golf course property and paying himself with taxpayer money, in violation of the law, to golf, while millions of Americans stared at the government shutdown cliffhanger and the relief package delay and wondered, when is this bullshit gonna end? Now, his supporters are probably the ones that have yet to really find that final straw that breaks the camel's back for them. And their endurance and pain tolerance is impressive. But put a pin in that, because we're going to talk about that in another episode. And I have already talked about how slowly but surely increasing numbers of formerly enthusiastic Trump supporters are walking away. Like alcoholics turning their back on their favorite bar, which I applaud. But this was an outrage, and it should have been pretty obvious to his base that by doing what he did, he was not effectively fighting for the little guys. And that was not a master stroke of genius deal-making. In fact, he had to back off on it. So he flip-flopped on his own flip-flopping and flopped back over on the flip that he just flopped and signed the bill. After letting people dangle, believing he would not sign it, that he would veto it. Did he achieve anything? No. Now, I've seen apologists explain that he's technically right. And you know what? I can't disagree. Yeah, send everybody $2,000 checks. They should have said that 9 months ago and sent everybody $2,000 deposits every month for the last 9 months. But they didn't. And quite specifically, and this is the part that it just astonishes me, the Trump base cheered the Trump administration on as it fought against the evil leftists' agenda to give too much money away. And then they cheered him when he chastised his own Republican base of leadership, his base leaders, for having negotiated and beaten the Democrats down to get what he wanted, which he now calls disgraceful, right? And he's calling out these things. Wait, let's clarify something in case you weren't aware. Most people are, but I think in the base, it's just all a big cloud of, yay, I love Trump, so none of the details matter. But they voted on they tried to vote on three different things, and Trump overtly vetoed the defense spending bill because it included an item about renaming bases with Confederate generals' names on it. And that kind of maneuver is only a winning maneuver with people who still want the Dixieland South to come back. And we don't need to even talk about that, because their nutcase argument for how they aren't racist is ridiculous and transparent. Anybody who is idolizing slave owners and rationalizing how that doesn't make them racist is in deep spiritual trauma and self-denial about, the ego traps that they're wrapped up in. So Trump vetoes that using that excuse. But so he's getting praise from his base because, well, I guess they a big chunk of them, I don't want to say all, but a big chunk of them really look up to Southern racist slave-owning generals for some reason or another. Despite that they are also supposedly big war hawks and all about keeping the military well-funded and stuff. It's just the constant compiling of oxymoronic, nonsensical things. Like, there's a time and a place for opposites to be mutually co-creative and sort of arise together. But that's not, like, that isn't what Trump is doing, The base should be outraged that he didn't negotiate with his unparalleled, brilliant negotiating skills and get a reasonable, meaningful number deposited in, the people who need it in their bank accounts, right? Instead, he did what he did. And in the end, what did anybody get out of it? Besides a bunch of turmoil, a bunch of stress for people who are in need, and a blatant display of disregard and disrespect from leadership for Americans who are suffering. And all of this happening right on top of the birthday party for baby Jesus. Now, I hate to sound like a broken record, but on the Jesus front, the GOP has got some explaining to do. Right? Like, why do they support profiteering on health when Jesus healed people for free? Why do they support profiteering on war when Jesus was a hardcore pacifist? I don't know. But here we are, living in a country living in a country where a certain portion of the population fights for the right to call this nation a Christian nation, but refuses to understand Christ and actually follow in his footsteps. I'm not claiming that I'm personally, perfectly following in his footsteps either, yo. I don't pretend to be anything I'm not. But I do think that it should be an outrage to the base that this is how he negotiates. In other somewhat related news, there seems to be a growing gap in the base. The anti-vaxxers in the Trump base are increasingly frustrated by all of this Project Warp Speed, go get your vaccine talk coming out of the Trump administration. And that's fascinating, and I am glad to be seeing folks who were clearly previously all gung-ho, 100%, balls deep into Trump. And now they're starting to question, like, why would he do that? Why would he claim to defend and protect the little guys and then go do something that the little guys didn't want him to do? But, you know, they're still also trying to wrap their brains around the fact that the vaccines are an evil, evil conspiracy theory that, and Trump claims, and even worse, I think, and I want to clarify something, right? Like, Trump manages his own message. Very few people write for Trump, and when they do, you can usually tell. It's kind of obvious. He sounds different. Oh. A forgotten alarm set for 9:30. Good morning! What was I saying? Trump, generally speaking, manages his own content. Okay? And I say that based on observation. From what I've observed of Trump, from before he announced he was going to run for office, he has control issues. He's fixated on his words being his own. He does like it when someone in his inner circle writes for him and he can sound better than he does when he reads his own words. Now, I'm making that distinction because, speculatively speaking, I think that the portion of the Trump base that self-identifies as QAnon followers, they are deeply convinced that the source of Q content is someone either really close to Trump or possibly Trump himself. But what I've noticed is that the claims being made over there in the Q world, in the bubble, in the Q echo chamber, right? They don't always line up and or match with claims, statements, and actions being made by Trump himself. He has his own echo chamber, his Twitter feed. He has his own echo chamber, and the Q echo chamber is separate. And that's why there's incongruencies. And that's why, increasingly, I see people walking away, if not from Trump completely, they're walking away from the nexus of Q and Trump, because it's like, this doesn't even make sense. But there are still plenty of people that are deeply convinced. And we'll have to put a pin in that, because I'm being really honest up front, full disclosure. While I have tried to wrap my head around Q content and the way it is delivered, I have not come to the level of understanding. I'm just not. It's all weird, and I'll talk about it if I ever do a show specifically about Q. I'll talk about that. But the one time, I got into this discussion with an acquaintance that provided for me a link to this Q website that I'd never heard of, right? Most of the Q content I've come across has been on sort of social media. I realized that they were, kind of apparently based over either in Reddit or 4chan. Neither one of the two platforms appeals to me purely at the level of how they function, never mind who's on it and what kind of content is on it. I just don't like the interface. And I generally have a hard time using something whose interface annoys me, so I generally don't use them. But I got sent to a website, and I don't know if this is deeper, more hardcore, or some sort of copycat, or some sort of diversion, or what, but I couldn't wrap my brain around the way the content was presented. It was so bizarre. At first glance, it just looked like a collection of memes and abstract statements with weird numbers and claims, and but mostly a bunch of memes. Most of them just sort of satirical and or rude about the other side. And occasionally some post with some text that had way too many links with no description as to where they're going. And no real clarity as to the claim being made. So, it was just a big pile of stuff. I saw no discernible organization. Now, they claim that there's this whole code and that they got timestamps and date stamps to prove that the prophecies came true. But the interesting thing is, when it comes to the nexus, the Venn diagram of Q prophecies and things that happened and can be factually verified, there's not a lot of overlap, right? Like the big one, Clinton never went to jail. She's not going to go to jail between now and January 20th. And despite the Trump claim that he will... Well, Trump's not even really claiming it anymore. The Trump base is convinced. Trump keeps sort of insinuating it, but he refuses to outright claim it. And he's sort of either Freudian slippage or is just fucking with people, has kind of more acknowledged that Biden is president-elect than not. He makes more noise about fraud and conspiracy and it being stolen than he says or claims that he's actually. But anyways, the whole Q thing is interesting. They've been, for 4 years now, they've been saying some shitstorm is coming. I don't know what. No one can give me a clear answer. They all say that you got to go and do the research, quote unquote, bunny ears of sarcasm and satire, in their, warren of rabbit holes. But so far, the implication has been, from what I understand, that Trump's going to hold the deep state accountable. He's going to drain the swamp, quote unquote. If draining the swamp for the last 4 years has led to this, I don't think they understand what drain the swamp means. He remodeled the swamp, and then he repopulated the swamp with his own monsters. But we can make a whole nother episode about that. There's this increasing, Jesus-ification of Trump, and I've already done an episode where it's like, I can debunk that in 2 seconds, right? There's no way that Trump is Jesus or any other saint because if he were Saint Bernard or whatever, the reincarnation of your favorite angel, whatever, he would be healing the sick for free. He wouldn't be mucking about with redonkulous maneuvers, delaying and postponing financial aid. He would be healing everyone for free. That's what Jesus did. Done. I don't need to hear about how he's some golden chosen one. He ain't doing golden chosen one type business. He's taking people's money in multiple ways and at multiple levels of potential criminality. Okay, I said I was going to talk a little bit about some interesting things coming out about the vaccine, which is its own epic thing. We could do a whole series of episodes about that. I'm not going to touch on the debate about whether or not it is real or alien DNA being pumped into us or robots. Here's what I wanted to talk about. Just like it was really weird and ridiculous to me that Trump spent 9 months ignoring the relief package and sending mixed signals and not actually facilitating the negotiations, only to throw a fucking monkey wrench on Christmas Eve and almost let the government shut down. Talk about a bullet dodged right there. The last thing we need is a multiple week government shutdown in the middle of a pandemic, in the midst of a presidential transition fraught with all kinds of shenanigans and accusations of fraudulent results. So as mysterious as that maneuver was, it's really quite fascinating that Trump's own Project Warp Speed results are being touted as much as they are by both sides, mind you. That's what's irritating the anti-vaxxers, is that Trump is self-congratulatory about this vaccination shit. And they convince themselves, although I don't remember any overt, specific, straight from his mouth claims that he was going to end vaccinations. The closest thing to any kind of statement like that was that he was going to lower the price of prescription drugs. Lowering the price of prescription drugs is not, quote, fighting big pharma and ending, quote, ending the tyranny of mandatory vaccinations. In fact, he's just bending over and doing exactly what big pharma wants, which is rushing multiple vaccines to market and encouraging people to take them and trust them. So, given it's been a very short period of time, one can indeed give credit to the Trump administration for the fact that, we approved now 2, soon to be 3, there's actually 5 companies working their way towards approval. 5! Does that sound like Trump is fighting Big Pharma? No, that sounds like Trump is having a big circle jerk party with Big Pharma. Excuse me. I'm not officially a member of the anti-vaxxer community because, as with most polarized and extreme opposites, my position is somewhere in the middle. But I understand their thinking. And if I was a member of that community, I would be joining anybody else standing up to speak out against Trump for betraying us one too many times. At any rate, he does deserve some... I'm not one of those people, right? So those people should be outraged, is what I'm saying. On the other hand, for those who appreciate that vaccines are coming online, the Trump administration deserves that credit. As of the last time I checked the numbers, and these may be already kind of outdated, because I think I did it like yesterday or the day before yesterday, but about 9.4 million doses of the vaccine have been distributed. That's probably maybe closer to 9.5, maybe 10 million by now. Maybe not, because there's been that weird hiccup, and I don't know how much stronger they resumed after that weird hiccup. But here's the thing that's really weird. And when I first heard this, I know this is a couple days ago, it was less. I updated it. So when I first wrote this note down, I was comparing the next figure. Only a little of, at the time of that writing, it's now doubled, but only a little over 1 million doses had been administered to recipients at that time. As of this morning, I believe that's at 2 million now. In Trumptopia, or the United States of America alone, in the duopoly of Trumptopia, the US of A, there's 384 million people or something along those lines, 360 something, 380. That's almost 400 million people. 2 million doses, which if you think about it, that's only half of the process, because that's the first dose out of a 2-dose vaccine, ain't dick to be celebrating. So those of us who don't appreciate Trump and his self-congratulatory nonsense should be critical there, right? Like, why are you congratulating yourself? Why are you trying to take all the credit for ending the pandemic when A, it's not over, B, we aren't vaccinating at the rate necessary for the theory to work, according to the theory of achieving artificial herd immunity through vaccination. Now, there's been a lot of talk lately about Trump administration trying to achieve herd immunity through just letting it rip through the world like wildfire. Those are two different kinds of herd immunity. The reason vaccine herd immunity is preferred, according to the theory, I'm not stating my personal opinion here in this moment, the reason it's preferred is because the vaccines, while providing the booster to your immune system's ability to fight a given virus by identifying it preemptively vis-a-vis, the mechanisms of the vaccine, and pre-building an army of antibodies so that the next time the body registers the vaccine, there's still some, in theory, there would still be some there would still be some antibodies laying around, hanging about, doing their things since the vaccine administration. And when they fire up the production of these antibodies and other fighting cells, they'll already be ready. Like they won't be like, what the fuck is this? It's a known enemy, according to the theory, right? Scientific theory. So if Trump is going to save the world through Project Operation Warp Speed, he really only deserves half the credit he's claiming. Because, yeah, they came to the market really fast, but the distribution, not that impressive, really, if you think about it. 2 million doses? I mean, that's the thing that the anti-vaxxers, no, forgive me, not them. The COVID deniers, the anti-mask COVID deniers, yes, there is some overlap between, I consider them three different sub-demographics. There's anti-maxers, and they disagree and or agree on whether or not COVID is real. There's COVID deniers, and they have different reasons for denying COVID. And there's anti-vaxxers, and they, depending on their position, variously overlap with the other two. The COVID deniers are making all kinds of fun right now, and will be in the coming weeks, with some sort of, based on ignorance, meme ridicule, trolling, about how the vaccine's a hoax and it doesn't work. Never mind that they've just spent a lot of time talking about how the disease itself is a hoax. But because what's going to happen right now, folks, to the best of my understanding, based on hearing out both sides of the argument and, the pro-science and the anti-science fight, and tempering everything with my sort of through line of what is the most organic, plausible, actual, realistic thing that might happen. If the distribution and the administration of the vaccine continues at the rate it's been going, and I'm not talking about whether or not I endorse this here, generally speaking. I have all kinds of other opinions here. But let's just presume it proceeds as it has been, and it, they smooth out and iron out the hiccups, but they don't really ramp it up, then we will be lucky, fortunate, if the required administration threshold is reached by midsummer of 2021. That would be a godsend. Okay? So, while the COVID deniers are, making fun of how come COVID isn't over now since the vaccine just came out, that kind of stuff, that kind of talk is just like how Trump was saying that you're going to stop hearing about COVID as soon as the election is over. Acknowledging he thought that Biden was going to win, and or was the winner, and or is the next pre-selected puppet. Because for those of you who haven't caught on, I don't hate Trump, But I do think he's a complicit tool of the very same system of oppression that he claims to be fighting against. And that is his role. And that is why he sets up these hypocrisies. So because of this, because of Trump promoting and sort of, just like the birtherism thing, he sort of helped establish and cement COVID denial in its various forms. With the claims that it's going to magically go away by April, May, June, July, August. Because, they just magically disappear like they do without ever having to do anything about it. By also then two-facedly promoting and embracing Big Pharma, like he does with his governors, right? He tells his base to rebel against his governors who are just trying to follow his effed up protocol for reopening. And, following his own administration's guidelines for shutting down. I've already talked about that. I'll probably come back around and talk about it again. Because it's absurd. It's absurd, right? Remember when he said, I alone can fix it? What he didn't say then, because he doesn't always say the quiet part out loud, sometimes he keeps the quiet part quiet, is that he's going to create a bunch of problems for him alone to fix. And that's not really solving a problem, is it? So in the intervening time, to get back to my whole issue with the vaccine distribution, and this is not a critique of the men and women working on the front lines. This is a critique of the top-down leadership and how the plan was developed and deployed to all those people on the front lines. If it continues at the rate it's going, we will be lucky if by summer we're beginning to reach the 100 million plus mark of delivered administered doses. And we need to get to at least, if there's 380 million people in America, we need to get to at least 200 million people vaccinated. That leaves plenty of room for the anti-vaxxers to not take it. Right? I don't think that they're that strong. I don't know. It'd be lovely to get a solid number on demographics like that, but you only get sort of estimates based on surveys. In that intervening time, anyone and everyone who either refuses to maintain or has never taken on the tyrannical burden of trying to do some of the risk reduction mitigation actions like washing your hands a little extra, wearing a mask at the store, and trying to stay in as much as possible, they are going to continue to get infected and shed the virus, especially those who never show symptomology. And there's not been a lot of talk about it, but there's been evidence of reinfection, right? From before the vaccine. And there's speculative talk that even after an individual has received the full double-dose vaccines of whatever kind, it is still very likely that they can get infected by the coronavirus, build up enough of a viral load to shed it actively, remain asymptomatic. Because one of the shortcomings of the vaccine is that, and this has nothing to do with the 95% effectiveness rate, right? This is included in that, to the best of my understanding. One of the shortcomings of the vaccine, in terms of how it works, is that, to the best of our understanding, it is not yet actually known if it completely prophylactically prevents invading viral matter from establishing a colony, as it were, right? They know that it mitigates symptomology and helps reduce the symptomology from exploding into a dangerous level. That's what they mean by the 95% effectiveness rate. People didn't get as sick. Now that includes being asymptomatic, which means technically not being sick. You can be, and I know that people have been convinced otherwise, but I know from personal practical experience with other infectious diseases, either direct or indirect through, hearing from people I know, you can get a disease and not realize it because you are asymptomatic until the disease does enough damage. And some disease, here's a fun fact about disease like survival, which people don't take into account. When this pandemic broke out, people were like, well, it's not as bad as in the movies. Like, no, because most viruses actually evolved to not be as lethal as they could be. The reason a viral infection is lethal is because as they multiply, they have to invade tissue cells. And then they cannibalize cells. They use material inside the cells to replicate themselves, and then they replicate to the point of bursting those cells and or causing damage. So at any rate, we face an uphill challenge. And there's a lot of people on the quote right side of the wedge issue that will be tempted, seduced by their own, ego traps to relax the mask wearing, relax the sanitizing of things, relax, et cetera, because the vaccine's here. Never mind if they've gotten it or not. Just that it's here, they're going to... I know that because I've been seduced by that kind of thinking. And I know that because I've heard people say so. So, I hate to sound like I'm on the side of the establishment, but I'm a risk reduction guy, right? Like, pragmatically speaking, I make choices based on my own risk assessment. And when it comes to this issue, I include the question of what if it's actually real? I understand the conspiracy theory content, and I don't disrespect it. And I get that people are really passionate about it. But what if this is really real? It's not outside of the realm of possibility. And if it's really real, I don't need such a stupid risk of perpetuating and transmitting the problem. Not now, and I can assure you, I understand what it feels like to officially be experiencing pandemic lockdown fatigue. But I implore you, dear friends and listeners, don't give in to that. Even if it's fake, because what if it's real? Now, that's not living in fear. That's making your choices based on your own analysis of your risk. And I get it. People do that, and they come to the conclusion that the risk isn't that bad and their freedoms are more important. But as I've asked before, if you're going to look at it that way, especially into the Rubicon of freedom, ask yourself, is it really freedom if you contribute to other people getting sick and other people dying? Is that freedom? Is it freedom if you contribute to the lack of equality for all people? Is that what freedom is? I don't think so, friends. But I've talked about it before, and I'll talk about it again, I'm sure, so I won't go further down that rabbit hole. We are in an interesting transitional place, friends. And it's been an exhausting year. So stay grounded, stay connected to your needs, stay sane, stay safe, rest well. And remember that we are all called to be the change we want to see in the world. So if the change you want to see in the world involves violence, you really should check yourself and ask yourself why. And if it doesn't, huzzah. I have been your humble and mildly eccentric host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And this has been Good Morning Trumptopia, a special segment of the Almost Daily Zencast, which is a production of CTAG Studios. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart. Take it away, DJ Zed, with an End Times album track, Remixed Executive Chill, a Remix Live Dubstep 101 remix. That's a lot of remixes in that title, DJ Zed. Do you have comments, questions, suggestions? Would you like to be featured in a future episode of this podcast? Then come on down to Spreaker.com/show/Zencast and follow the show. Drop your comments under the episodes that inspire them. You can also visit the Almost Daily Zencast fan page on Facebook. Your comments, questions, suggestions, ideas, and theories are of course welcome. If you send me an audio recording to theincorrigiblemrzeppo@gmail.com, I'll play it on the air. All recordings should be limited to 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Thanks for listening. Your support is appreciated.